On a rainy Tuesday night in the heart of Chicago, behind the velvet-draped walls of the Golden Chalice, 5 men entered with a single purpose: to bring down a king. Their target was Richard Kane, a titan of industry whose net worth rivaled the economies of small nations. They were professionals, silent, quick, and ruthless. But before we continue the story, write which city you are from. It's important for us to know where our stories reach. They expected security systems, maybe even a police response. What they did not expect, what no plan could have accounted for, was the quiet waitress clearing plates in the corner. Her name was Claire Dawson. To them, she was just a servant. They were about to face something very different. This was not the story of a robbery. It was the story of how one woman's hidden past erupted into the present, and in the span of 12 minutes, shifted the balance of power in a city built on it. The Golden Chalice was not a hangout for the new money crowd that flaunted wealth online. It was a relic, a sanctuary of old-world discretion, tucked away on a calm street in the Gold Coast. Its guests were people whose names were whispered, not shouted, engraved on plaques in libraries and carved into hospital wings. That Tuesday night, the rain outside blurred the city into shimmering distorted portraits on the restaurant's leaded glass windows. Inside, the atmosphere was one of muted elegance. Warm light glinted across polished silverware and crystal glasses. The air carried the scents of old leather, roasted duck, and money so ancient it no longer needed to be loud. Through that carefully maintained calm moved Claire, a shadow in a crisp black uniform. To any casual observer, she was unremarkable, and that was by design. At 27, she had mastered the art of invisibility. Her movements were efficient and silent, her face calm and neutral. She refilled glasses before they ran dry, cleared plates the instant a fork was set down, and anticipated the check with an almost uncanny sense. By all accounts, she was an excellent server. But beneath that calm exterior, Claire was a fortress of observation. She didn't just see her guests, she catalogued them. The man in booth 4, Mr. Whitmore, always twisted his wedding ring when he lied to his dinner companion. The couple by the window, the Harrisons, were on the edge of divorce, revealed by the small distance they kept between their wine glasses. Claire noticed everything: the shift of a posture, the clench of a jaw, the flicker of an eye. She had learned this not in hospitality school, but in the crucible of a past she had buried deep beneath practiced smiles and polite nods. Around her neck, hidden under her uniform, hung a simple silver locket on a thin chain. Years of anxious habit had worn it smooth. It was the only piece of her old life she still carried, a reminder of a promise she had once made to herself, a vow sealed in blood and tears long ago. She would never be a victim again. She would always see the storm before it broke. At exactly 8:15, the bell above the heavy oak door chimed softly. Richard Kane entered, and the room seemed to shift around him. Conversations paused, heads turned. Kane was not just rich, he was power personified. As CEO of Kane Global, a sprawling conglomerate with reach from aerospace engineering to private military logistics, he could move markets with a single call. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, but his sharp blue eyes carried a weariness that even immense wealth could not hide. He never came with a security detail, something that always surprised the staff. He always came alone, always on the second Tuesday of the month. He did not come for the food, though it was exquisite, or for the flawless service. He came for a memory. "Your usual table, Mr. Kane," said Martin, the maitre d', with the calm poise of a retired diplomat, offering a respectful nod. He led Kane to booth 7, a quiet alcove at the back. It had been his late wife's favorite spot. Claire knew this not because anyone told her, but because she had seen the way his gaze would sometimes drift to the empty seat across from him, a flicker of grief in an otherwise guarded expression. She stepped to his table, notepad ready. "Good evening, Mr. Kane. May I bring you something to start with?" He didn't lift his eyes from the menu, though he already knew. "Macallan 25. Neat." His voice was a low baritone shaped by years of command. "Of course," Claire answered, her tone soft and professional. She turned to go. "And, Miss Dawson." She stopped. It was unusual for him to use her name. He finally looked up, his piercing gaze fixed on her, assessing her with the same sharp focus he would use in a boardroom. "Is the cocoa vin as good as it was last month?" It was a simple question, but also a test. Was the chef still in charge? Had the standard slipped? Was the order of his world intact? Chef Laurent is in excellent form tonight, sir, she replied evenly. I believe it will exceed expectations. A flicker, approval, maybe even a faint smile, touched his face before it vanished. Very well. Claire walked back toward the bar, her senses alert. Something felt different. It wasn't Kane, he was the constant. It was in the air, a subtle charge, a hum of tension beneath the room's calm. She brushed it off as the storm outside pressing against the walls of the city. She was wrong. At the bar, as she poured the rare and expensive scotch, she caught her reflection in the mirror behind the bottles. The face staring back was a mask, plain, forgettable. No one would ever guess the violence her hands had known. No one could see the memories behind her gray eyes, memories from a life where watching people was not a job skill but survival. The locket at her chest felt suddenly cold. It reminded her of the vow she had made long ago. She would never be powerless again. She would always see the storm before it came. But even she could not see the hurricane about to enter through that door. At 20 minutes to 9, the bell above the entrance rang again, but this time the sound was different. Not the soft tone of another guest, but a sharp, discordant clang, as if the door had been opened with force instead of grace. 5 men entered. They did not come together but in a staggered sequence, almost balletic in precision. The first 2 were unremarkable, wearing dark, fitted suits, too practical for a place like the Golden Chalice. They passed the maitre d' without a word. One positioned himself with a clear view of the entrance. The other moved smoothly toward the hallway to the restrooms, scanning the dining room with sharp eyes. Martin began to speak, but the first man gave the slightest shake of his head. The message was clear. This was not a request. This was a takeover. The next 2 men were larger, their broad shoulders stretching the seams of their jackets. Beneath the fabric, Claire could see the bulge of body armor and the outline of holstered weapons. They carried themselves with the slow, heavy confidence of men who knew violence intimately. One leaned against the wall near the bar, his gaze sweeping the room in a professional, measured pattern. The other stopped at the kitchen doors, blocking the staff's main way out. The guests began to notice. Forks froze midair. Conversations died. The warm and convivial atmosphere dissolved in seconds, replaced by something cold and sharp. Fear thickened the air. Claire was behind the bar, polishing a wine glass. The cloth squeaked softly across crystal, the lone ordinary sound in a room that had fallen unnaturally quiet. Her hands kept moving, but her mind raced, sorting the scene with ruthless clarity. This was not a robbery. Robbers are loud and chaotic, they come for cash drawers and chaos. These men were the opposite, silent, organized, and focused on a single objective. Claire's eyes flicked from one figure to the next, taking in their stances, posture, and the gleam of earpieces. They were building a perimeter, a kill box, and at its center sat Booth 7. A 5th man entered. He was not larger than the others, only average height, with dark hair slicked back and hawk-like, predatory features. He wore a bespoke Italian suit that likely cost more than Claire made in 3 months. He moved with a slow, languid arrogance, his gaze locking on Richard Kane's table with ice-cold intensity. A thin, cruel smile cut his mouth, but it never reached those dark eyes. This was Victor Romano, known in the circles that hired men like him as the Ghost, a specialist in extractions and corporate persuasion of the brutal kind. Claire's blood ran cold. She recognized the formation, the classic box-and-seal tactic designed to control a room and crush resistance. She had studied diagrams of tactics like this in tattered training manuals from a life she kept carefully buried. Her hand moved without thought to the worn silver locket under her shirt, the familiar cold weight anchoring her as adrenaline rose. Romano glided toward Booth 7, his expensive leather shoes whispering on the carpet. The 2 big men moved as if on cue, flanking him so their purpose was obvious. Richard Kane watched the room's events through the reflection in his scotch glass. When Romano reached the table, Kane did not look shocked, he looked annoyed, as if a poorly timed business interruption had arrived. He took a slow sip before lifting his eyes. "Romano," Kane said, contempt threaded through the baritone. "I should have known you'd send a dog with a designer collar. You're not here to discuss the chef's stew, are you?" Romano's smile widened. "Mr. Kane, always a pleasure," he said smoothly. "But my employer, Mr. Grant, felt our last conversation was left unfinished. He requested a more personal debriefing." He gestured broadly to the room. No distractions. At that signal, one of the larger men pulled a compact, suppressed pistol from his jacket. The weapon was not pointed at anyone yet, but its presence screamed danger through the silence. A woman at a nearby table gave a choked gasp. Phones were put face down on white tablecloths. The man at the bar spoke, his voice a low growl that sliced clean through fear. Slowly, shaking hands placed cell phones on tables. Claire's mind fired through 1,000 tiny calculations. Kitchen door blocked. Main entrance controlled. 2 heavy enforcers, 2 scouts, 1 leader, target Kane. Objective extraction, not assassination. Otherwise Kane would already be dead. Claire caught the dismissive glance of the man posted at the kitchen door. To him she was scenery, a waitress, a non-threat. It was the same mistake people always made about her, and the mistake she counted on. Romano leaned in toward Kane, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We can do this the easy way, Richard, or the hard way. The hard way involves me redecorating this fine place with the blood of innocent people. The choice is yours. You will come with us, and you will bring the Phoenix Drive." At the mention of the Phoenix Drive, Kane's facade cracked for the first time. A tiny flash of shock crossed his features, enough for Romano to see. "Ah," Romano purred. "So you do have it on you. Excellent. That will save us time." He clicked his fingers. 2 of the larger men moved to seize Kane. This was the point of no return. Claire set the wine glass down on the bar with a deliberate, soft click. In the crushing hush, that small sound became an event. The man posted at the bar turned his head, brow creasing in irritation. In that split second, Claire Dawson stopped being merely a waitress. The invisible woman vanished. In her place stood someone forged by pain and sharpened by discipline, terrifyingly capable. Her posture snapped from a courteous slump into a coiled line of steel. Her placid face hardened into a mask of lethal focus. Her world narrowed to threats, angles, and openings. The storm was no longer outside, it was in the room, and she was at its center. Her first move was precise and brutal, not panic but a cold calculation of force. The enforcer at the bar, the man who had turned toward the clique, posed the biggest immediate threat because he had the clearest line of fire across the most patrons. He had to be stopped first. Claire moved with a speed that seemed impossible. One heartbeat she stood behind the bar, the next she flowed over it in a blur of black and white. She did not vault the counter with graceful showmanship, she used it as a launch. In her right hand she now held a heavy, filled bottle of bourbon, an object her body had chosen as the best available tool. The enforcer, Alexei, had only a moment to process the impossible sight of a waitress airborne and bearing down on him. His hand went for his weapon, but he was a fraction too slow. Claire's feet hit the floor and she pivoted, channeling all momentum into the arc of the swing. The bottle thudded into the side of Alexei's head with a sick, wet sound that did not shatter glass. The impact drove force into his skull. His eyes rolled back and the 250-pound man crumpled like a puppet whose strings had been cut, slumping in a limp heap. He was out before his body hit the floor. A stunned, collective gasp ran through the restaurant, pure, stunned disbelief. Romano, in the act of hauling a stunned Richard Kane to his feet, froze. "Jesus," the other heavy near the kitchen barked, Luis, turning his attention and his weapon toward Claire. That shift was the opening she had created. She didn't hesitate. She kicked a heavy bar stool, sending it skittering across polished wood straight into Luis's path. He instinctively sidestepped to avoid it, a microcorrection that cost him a precious half-second and threw off his balance. That was all Claire needed. She lunged low, moving beneath the likely line of fire, not to trade blows but to reach the kitchen. She slammed through the swinging double doors just as a gunshot cracked. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space. A woman screamed. A bullet meant for Claire shattered the wooden doorframe where her head had been a heartbeat before. Inside the stainless steel kitchen, the staff, 1 chef, 2 sous chefs, and a dishwasher, huddled in a corner, eyes wide with terror. "Out back. Get the back door." Claire snapped, her voice hard and sharp, no room for argument. They scrambled, fumbling with the heavy steel door that led to the alley. Luis kicked the swinging doors open, pistol locked in a two-handed grip, and pushed inside with the kind of controlled menace of a trained enforcer. Claire was already moving. On a prep counter a cast-iron skillet still steamed from searing scallops. Without thinking, she seized it by the handle, the heat barely registered against her adrenaline-numb skin. She threw it like a discus. Luis had been sweeping the room for targets. He did not expect a hot skillet to come at him from the left. The heavy skillet struck Luis hard on the shoulder and across the wrist of his gun hand. He let out a grunt of pain, his aim wavering, his wrist screaming in protest. That was her second window. While he struggled to recover, Claire lunged. She didn't attack the pistol. She attacked his body. She slammed her shoulder directly into his sternum, using his size against him, forcing him backward and off balance. Her left hand shot out, gripping his gun wrist, not to rip the weapon away, but to push its barrel toward the ceiling. Her right hand curled into a tight fist and drove 3 rapid, punishing blows into his throat. He gagged, his eyes bulging, the air forced out of his lungs. His grip faltered. Claire twisted his wrist in a sharp, practiced movement that could have snapped the bone if she had added just a fraction more pressure. The pistol clattered across the tile floor. She didn't stop. She hooked her leg behind his and swept him down. He crashed hard, his skull striking the corner of a steel prep table with a sickening crack. His body went limp. 2 down. The kitchen went silent except for the panicked breathing of the staff. The chef, 2 sous chefs, and the dishwasher finally got the back door open and spilled out into the rain-soaked alley. From beyond the swinging doors came the muffled, terrified whimpers of the guests trapped in the dining room. For a second Claire stood in the center of the kitchen, chest heaving, her heart pounding like a jackhammer inside her ribs. The silver locket at her chest burned hot against her skin. This was the part of herself she had tried to kill, the discipline, the violence, the razor-sharp focus that came alive in the middle of chaos. It was the legacy of Sergeant Miller, the relentless man who had drilled one lesson into her until it was etched into her DNA: hesitation is death. Act, react, control. Claire scooped up the pistol from the floor. The weight was instantly familiar. A Glock 19. She slid the magazine out. Nearly full. Her movements were smooth, ingrained, a muscle memory she had not touched in 5 long years. Out in the dining room, Victor Romano's fury boiled over into something white-hot. He shoved Richard Kane back into the booth. "Stay," he barked, as though speaking to a dog. The 2 remaining scouts, Mark and Jason, had already drawn their weapons. They advanced cautiously toward the kitchen doors, their steps uneven, their nerves showing through in every movement. They were scouts, observers, not frontline brawlers. They were already out of their depth. "What the hell is she?" Mark whispered, his voice shaking, his eyes wide. "It doesn't matter," Romano snapped into his earpiece. "Take her down now. Use of force is authorized. I want her on the floor." Claire heard the shuffle of their shoes on the carpet outside the kitchen. She knew they expected her to burst out firing. So she chose the opposite. On the stove a pot of water had been left boiling. Steam rose from it in violent clouds. She gripped it with a dish towel, braced herself against the wall, and slowed her breathing. 1 heartbeat. 2. She kicked the door open with her foot and in the same motion hurled the scalding water in a wide arc. A scream of agony tore through the restaurant as the boiling water splashed across Jason's face and chest. He dropped his weapon, clawing at his blistering skin, his professional mask obliterated by raw pain. Mark, struck only by stray drops, flinched and staggered back, shocked. Claire burst from the doorway like a cannon shot. She ignored the man writhing in screams and drove straight at Mark. The Glock was held low and close against her body. He tried to bring his pistol up, but she was already inside his guard. She rammed the heavy base of the Glock's grip upward into his chin. His teeth clacked together, his head snapped back, and his consciousness vanished. He collapsed in a heap. 3 and 4 down. Now only Romano was left. Claire pivoted, gun leveled, stance perfect, hands steady. She and Victor Romano faced each other across 20 feet of wreckage, separated by overturned tables and the huddled, terrified patrons still crouching on the floor. Richard Kane sat frozen in his booth, his face locked in a mask of disbelief. Romano had his pistol fixed directly on Kane's head, a stalemate. "Drop it," Romano said, his voice calm and deadly. The anger in his eyes burned down to cold embers. "Drop it now, or your billionaire gets a third eye." Claire's gaze was unyielding. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger. "You walk out that door right now. You leave, and you live," she told him, her voice steady, empty of fear. Romano barked out a harsh, grating laugh. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, little girl. You think you're some hero? You're just a waitress. I am Victor Romano. I have toppled governments for men like him." He jerked his pistol toward Kane. "I don't care if your name is Caesar," Claire answered, her voice dropping to an icy whisper. "You brought your war into my house. You threatened my guests. And I am asking you politely, one last time, to leave." For the first time, Romano saw her. Truly saw her. Not a uniform. Not a servant. He saw the way her shoulders squared, the unwavering focus in her eyes, the professional precision in the way she held her weapon. He saw a predator staring back at him. And in that instant, a thin crack opened in his armor of confidence. Doubt, something he hadn't felt in years, slid into his chest. Who was this woman? The stalemate stretched thin, fragile as glass. The air in the golden chalice hung heavy with gunpowder, fear, and expensive perfume. Romano kept his pistol locked on Kane, but his eyes clung to Claire. His mind, trained for threat assessment, couldn't categorize her. She wasn't police, her movements too raw, too fast, lacking the stiffness of procedure. She wasn't military, her focus was on disabling, not killing. She was something else. Something he had never faced before. "You've made a serious mistake, Waitress," Romano sneered, forcing his voice into control. "Mr. Grant pays handsomely for results. But he pays even more for loyalty. My men will be well rewarded for their inconvenience." Claire didn't flinch. Her eyes shifted, not away from him but past him, toward the ornate mirror on the wall behind the bar. In its warped reflection she saw the front entrance. No sirens. No flashing lights. Someone must have called 911, but in the gridlock of a storm-soaked Chicago night, response time was never certain. For now, it was still just them. "This doesn't have to end with anyone else getting hurt," she said, her voice even. It wasn't a plea, it was fact. An escape route he was too proud to take. Kane, still in the booth, began to rise. He was a man who had always been the actor in any room, and his instincts screamed at him to do something. "Stay down." Claire and Romano snapped in unison, both whipping their heads toward him. In that shared second of distraction, the balance shifted. Romano seized his chance. Shooting Kane would end the mission. Extracting him was the goal. Instead, he fired into the floor directly in front of the booth. The explosion ripped through the silence. Splinters flew from the antique wood. Kane flinched violently and crashed back into the cushions. The thunder of the shot had done its job, shock and sensory overload. Claire's eyes flicked toward the blast. Romano moved. Not toward her, sideways. He dove behind a heavy overturned oak table, using it for cover. He was a professional. He knew the value of solid protection. "You're good," he called, his voice muffled behind the table. "I'll give you that. But you're just one person. And I have nothing but time." Claire's mind churned. He was right. In a prolonged standoff, she would lose. She had to finish this fast. She shifted direction, moving not straight at him but along the booths, using them as cover, circling toward the center of the dining floor. The standoff turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse among the wreckage of fine dining. "Who trained you?" Victor Romano called out, his voice probing, trying to read her. "Mossad? Some agency? You're no ordinary soldier." Claire said nothing. She did not want him tracing her voice, did not want to give away her exact position. She moved like smoke, her soft-soled shoe soundless on the carpet. Passing one of the overturned tables, she caught sight of a terrified couple crouched beneath it. The man had his arms wrapped around the woman, shielding her with his body. Her eyes met his for a heartbeat. There was no apology in her gaze, only a silent promise, cold and unyielding. "Stay down. I'll take care of this." She slipped to the front of the dining room, toward the maitre d's station. On top of it rested a solid bronze statue of a swan, easily weighing 20 pounds. A desperate, dangerous idea took shape. Meanwhile, Romano grew restless. He couldn't see her. The invisibility unnerved him. He rose from behind his table for a quick glance. Nothing. He ducked back down. He was about to shift to another position when movement caught his eye, not from the booths, but from the rain-streaked front window. A figure. For one fatal second, he saw Claire's form reflected in the glass. He reacted instantly, rising and firing 2 quick shots. Crack. Crack. The window shattered inward, spraying glass and rain across the room. Wind and street noise rushed in. But Claire wasn't there. What Romano had shot at was only her jacket draped over the bronze swan, held high for just a second to throw a false reflection. A classic misdirection. While he fired at the phantom, Claire sprinted low and fast from the side, closing in. He realized the mistake the instant he pulled the trigger. He spun to adjust, but she was already on him. She hit him like a linebacker, and they went down together in a tangle of limbs. Romano's gun flew from his hand, skittering across the floor. Now it was primal. No guns, only skill and will. Romano was strong, his body corded with muscle from years of training. He twisted, trying to get on top, to crush her with his weight. But Claire was a storm of controlled violence. She wasn't trying to overpower him, she was dismantling him piece by piece. Her elbow drove into his ribs, sharp and punishing. He gasped, the air blasted from his lungs. The heel of her hand smashed into the bridge of his nose. He heard the crunch, his eyes watering, pain exploding through his skull. He swung a wild fist, powerful but desperate, aiming for her head. She ducked beneath it. As his arm swept past, she locked it into a joint hold, twisting his elbow in a direction it was never meant to bend. Romano screamed, a raw, animal sound, nothing like his earlier suave demeanor. The pain tore past training, past discipline. The drive, he choked, blood from his broken nose bubbling into his mouth. Even shattered, he was still locked on his mission. Where is the drive? Claire ignored him. She wrenched his arm further, her face hard with fury. This was for the terrified patrons. This was for the sanctuary she had protected for 5 years. This was for the vow she had made over her brother Daniel's grave. With one final, sickening pop, she dislocated his elbow. Romano's scream collapsed into a broken sob. His body trembled, his fight gone. He was finished. Claire rose, breathing hard. She looked down at the man who had dragged chaos into her world. His face was a mess of blood and tears, his expensive suit ruined. She felt no pity. Only grim satisfaction. Her eyes swept the room. The other 4 men were down, unconscious or incapacitated. The guests still cowered, watching her with a mixture of awe and terror. From booth 7, Richard Kane slowly stood, his face pale, his blue eyes fixed on her with an unreadable mix of shock and confusion. The battle was over. The violence had ended. But for Claire Dawson, the real war was only beginning. Because a name still rang in her mind. A name Romano had spoken. Grant. Her blood ran colder than at any moment in the fight. Edward Grant. She knew that name. And knowing who he was, and what he had meant to her past, hit her harder than any blow. The aftermath unfolded in surreal fragments. Sirens, distant but growing closer, bled into the night through the shattered window. Sobs from a few patrons mixed with Romano's ragged breathing. Claire stood in the center of the wreckage she had created, Glock loose in her hand, no longer aimed at anything. Her adrenaline drained away, leaving bone-deep exhaustion and the metallic tang of violence on her tongue. Her knuckles were scraped raw. A bruise already darkened her cheek where one of Romano's wild swings had grazed her. She didn't feel it. All she felt was the crushing weight of that name, Edward Grant. Just moments earlier her mind had been a marvel of clarity. Now it was a storm of memory. She saw the community center on the south side of Chicago, dusty and underfunded. She saw the cluster of scared, angry kids, herself among them, adrift after the senseless murder of her older brother Daniel, stabbed over a $20 debt. And she saw the man who appeared like an angel, soft-spoken, with graying hair and gentle eyes. Edward Grant. He had not just been a benefactor. He had been a savior. He used his own fortune to renovate the center, to build a boxing gym, to hire counselors. He personally funded the self-defense program taught by Sergeant Miller, a hardened former Special Forces operative he had brought in. Grant had seen the raw, untamed rage in 16-year-old Claire and had pointed her toward Miller's class. Discipline, Claire, he told her, his voice kind. It turns anger into strength. It gives you control. He gave her an outlet. He gave her a future. The very skills that had just saved Richard Kane's life, the deepest and most secret parts of who she was, were a direct gift from the man who had sent these killers. The world tilted beneath her. She had just protected Richard Kane, a man she knew only from business headlines, from the fallout of a war with Edward Grant, the man who had once saved her. The irony landed like a physical blow, stealing her breath more effectively than any punch. Miss Dawson, Kane's voice cut through her thoughts. He had stepped from his booth and now stood just feet away. His suit remained immaculate, except for a dusting of plaster from a stray bullet. His face was a strange mask, shock, gratitude, and sharp curiosity. He looked at her not as a server, but as a puzzle to be solved. "Are you all right?" he asked. Her throat was tight. She could only nod. Her eyes shifted to the broken man on the floor, Victor Romano, the ghost. He was Grant's man. He worked for the same benefactor who had once taught her never to be a victim. And now she had crippled him, all to protect, who, exactly? They wanted the Phoenix Drive, Kane said suddenly, his voice low, his eyes flicking around to make sure no one was near enough to overhear. How could he know about that? Claire finally found her voice, but it came out a strained whisper. What is it? Kane hesitated, his gaze sweeping over her, measuring. It's a contingency plan. Insurance. Data insurance. He spoke evasively, the natural language of men like him. Romano let out a wet, broken laugh, blood flecking his lips. Insurance, he spat. He calls it insurance. Grant calls it theft. The intellectual property of a project that could have changed the world, before this vulture gutted his company and stole it for himself. Claire's eyes snapped back to Kane, burning with a silent question. Kane's jaw tightened. Grant's project was reckless, unstable, Richard Kane said, his voice hard. It would have destabilized the entire global financial system. I didn't steal it. I contained it. I did what was necessary to stop a catastrophe. You did what was necessary to protect your monopoly, Romano snarled back, his words dripping with rage. You ruined him. A good man. You left him with nothing. Each word struck Claire like a hammer against the foundation of her world. A good man. She knew Edward Grant had been a good man. She was proof of his goodness. He had never taken anything from her, he had given her everything. And this man, Richard Kane, had destroyed him. She realized with a jolt that she had just protected the villain in her savior's story. The silver locket around her neck felt impossibly heavy, like a millstone dragging her down. Inside it was a tiny, folded photograph of her and her brother Daniel, taken a week before he died. The community center Grant had built was supposed to be his legacy. Everything she had learned, every battle she had fought, had been in service of honoring that memory, paying forward the kindness Grant had once given her. And now? She had fought to protect a corporate predator's insurance drive. Her grip on the Glock loosened. Its weight suddenly felt unbearable. Kane saw the shift in her eyes, the doubt, the conflict, the dangerous wavering of her allegiance. He was a master at reading people, and he knew he was losing her. Miss Dawson, he said, his voice dropping low, more personal, almost urgent. I don't know what that man, Grant, meant to you. But I can tell you this. The world isn't made of good men and bad men. It's a machine. Complex, fragile. Grant wanted to burn it all down to build his utopia. I am trying to keep it running. The wail of sirens grew louder, a crescendo closing in. The window of opportunity was almost gone. Romano, seeing the turmoil on her face, pushed harder. He's lying, he rasped, coughing, trying to push himself up with his one good arm. Grant wanted to level the playing field. Give power back to people like you. Kane can't stand that. He needs his boot pressed on the world's throat. Claire looked from the bloodied enforcer to the powerful tycoon. Both claimed the moral high ground. Both stood knee-deep in violence and greed. And she was the fulcrum between them, standing in the wreckage with a gun in her hand, not knowing which way to turn. Police would burst in any second. They would see a waitress holding a gun in a room full of bodies. They would see a billionaire survivor. The story would write itself, and she would be painted as the monster. But for one more moment, before the flashing lights painted the broken windows in red and blue, the choice was still hers. Who was she? The grateful orphan of Edward Grant's charity, or the protector of the man Grant had called his destroyer? Her hidden skill had changed everything. And now a hidden truth threatened to undo it all. The sirens wailed right outside, the rhythmic pulses flashing red and blue across the shattered glass. In seconds, uniforms would storm the room with questions and consequences. This was the last breath of her autonomy. After this, the world would impose its narrative. Kane, reading the conflict in her eyes, made a desperate play. Not a threat. Not a command. But a calculated appeal to the woman he had just seen in action. Miss Dawson, he said again, this time deliberately using her first name. Whatever you believe about me, or about Grant, look around you. He gestured to the terrified patrons. These people. They don't care about the Phoenix Drive. They don't care about corporate espionage. They were caught in the crossfire of a war they didn't choose. You didn't save me. You saved them. The words struck her. She looked around. She saw the couple she had passed earlier now helping an elderly woman to her feet. She saw Martin, the maitre d', quietly reassuring his staff. Kane was right. Her actions, born of a vow over a locket, had become a shield for everyone in this restaurant. Her loyalty wasn't to Kane. It wasn't even to Grant. It was to the innocent. It was to her promise that no one in her presence would ever again be left defenseless. The conflict in her eyes did not vanish, but it sharpened into resolve. It wasn't about choosing sides. It was about ending the fight. Claire stepped forward, slow and purposeful, until she stood over Victor Romano. He flinched as her shadow fell across him. "The drive," she said, her voice flat, a command. "Mr. Kane isn't leaving with you tonight. But your employer still wants his property. So you're going to carry him a message." Romano looked up at her, confused, suspicious. Kane, watching, could not hide his mix of apprehension and fascination. "What message?" Romano rasped. "You tell Edward Grant that the Phoenix Drive is now in the hands of a third party," Claire said, her tone cold and precise. "It is secure. It is no longer in play. If he or anyone else ever comes after Mr. Kane, or anyone in this room again, the contents of the drive will be released to every major news agency and financial regulator in the world." Kane's eyes widened. She was bluffing. She didn't have the drive. But Romano couldn't know that. All he could see was the conviction in her eyes. "You don't have it," he croaked. Claire leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper only he could hear. "Your men are alive. Broken, but alive. I could have killed all of you. I didn't. Do I look like someone who bluffs? You tell him Daniel's sister has it. He'll understand." The name struck Romano like a key turning in a lock. This wasn't random. This was personal. A ghost from Grant's past had just become his biggest liability. He nodded weakly, all fight gone. Claire rose and turned to Kane. She flipped the Glock in her hand, offering it grip first. "I believe this belongs to you," she said calmly, as if returning a misplaced coat. Kane stared at the weapon, then back at her. He understood instantly. She hadn't chosen him. She had chosen neutrality. She had created a stalemate, a balance of fear, a mutually assured destruction that protected him better than any bodyguard ever could. And in doing so, she had seized control of the entire game. He didn't take the gun. Outside, boots pounded on the pavement. "The police will need that," he said quietly. "They'll have questions. Many of them. Let my lawyers handle it. Say nothing until they arrive." "I can handle my own questions," she answered, steel in her voice. He gave a small, wry smile. "Of course you can." He reached into his jacket. Claire tensed, ready, but he wasn't drawing a weapon. From a hidden pocket, he pulled out a tiny object, a data drive no bigger than a thumbnail, shaped like a golden feather. The Phoenix Drive. Without a word, he pressed it into her hand. Her fingers closed around it, the warmth of his hand, the cold weight of the object. It was either an act of reckless trust or the most calculated move of his life. He was placing his insurance in the only hands that had proven strong enough to defend it. He was moving his queen to the most unpredictable square on the board. "You called it a third party," he murmured, just as the first officers burst through the doors. "Now you are one." Blue uniforms swarmed the room, weapons drawn. "Chicago PD. Drop the weapon. Hands in the air." Slowly, Claire set the Glock down on a nearby table. She raised her empty hands, her right fist clenched tight around the tiny drive that had caused all this chaos. Her face was calm. Her expression unreadable. She was no longer just Claire Dawson, the waitress. She was no longer just the shadow from Sergeant Miller's training room. She was something new, forged in the crucible of that night. As the police secured the scene, cuffing the groaning men and calling for medics, a detective approached Claire and Richard Kane. Kane immediately took control, his voice regaining its commanding tone, weaving a story about a robbery gone wrong, about a brave waitress who had defended herself and everyone else. He was protecting her, spinning a version of events that would keep her out of a prison cell. But Claire knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. She had stepped out of the shadows and, in doing so, placed herself in the center of a war between two powerful, ruthless men, one who had saved her life, and the other whose life she had just saved. And in her hand she held the device that could destroy them both. The question was no longer about whose side she was on, but what she would build from the ashes. The days that followed blurred into a carefully managed whirlwind. Richard Kane's legal team descended like a tactical unit, turning the chaos at the Golden Chalice into a polished story fit for police reports and headlines. The official version was simple: a robbery thwarted, and Claire Dawson, the brave waitress with surprising skill in self-defense. The truth was buried beneath paperwork and non-disclosure agreements. A week later, Claire was not in a police station, but in Kane's office, a glass fortress at the top of Chicago. He stood by the window, a silhouette against the vast sprawl of the city. "I owe you a debt that money can't repay," he began, turning toward her. "Though you'll find a sum has been transferred to a private account, enough to give you freedom to live as you wish. But that isn't why I brought you here." His gaze sharpened. "I'm not offering you a job as a bodyguard. A bodyguard reacts. I need someone who acts first." He gestured toward the skyline. "My empire has 1,000 enemies, corporate rivals, politicians, men like Grant. I fight them in boardrooms, but the rules are changing. I need a new department. One that works in the gray. It will be yours to build, from the ground up. You will answer only to me. Your mandate: neutralize threats before they even have a name." It was an offer of immense power, a kingdom in the shadows. Claire met his eyes, her face unreadable. For 5 years she had run from her skills, and now she was being asked to build a throne on them. "I accept," she said at last. "On 2 conditions." Kane's eyebrow arched. "First," Claire said firmly, "Edward Grant is left alone. No retaliation from you or your company. The stalemate I created stands. He stays down, and you leave him there." It was bold, protecting his enemy. Kane considered, then gave a single, sharp nod. "Done." "Second," she continued, her voice low, steady, "I keep the Phoenix Drive." She held up the tiny feather-shaped device she had concealed since that night. "It doesn't belong to you. It doesn't belong to him. It belongs to me. It is my leverage, Mr. Kane. My guarantee that the necessary actions your company takes will never cross a line I cannot defend." She wasn't asking to be his weapon. She was setting herself up as his check, his balance. For a long moment Kane studied her, silent. Then a slow smile spread across his face, a look of genuine respect. He had expected a soldier. Instead, he had found a strategist. "Welcome to Kane Global, Ms. Dawson," he said, extending his hand. Claire took it. As their hands clasped, a new contract was sealed high above the city. The waitress was gone, a ghost left behind in an empty restaurant. In her place stood the director of his most secret operations, a queen on a board of her own design, guarding the line between protection and power. And so the story of that rainy night at the Golden Chalice ended. But the story of Claire Dawson had only just begun. It was a reminder that behind the most ordinary faces can lie extraordinary strength, and that our deepest scars often become the source of our greatest power. This was not a tale of good against evil, but of the messy, complex gray where true character is forged. A billionaire. A benefactor. And the woman caught between them. Who was truly right? What would you have done with that kind of power in your hands? The lines are never as clear as they seem. If this story of courage, conflict, and the birth of a new kind of power resonated with you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this video with a friend who appreciates a story with depth and unexpected turns. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We have many more stories to share, stories that go beyond the headlines to explore the incredible complexities of the human spirit. Your support makes it possible. Thank you for listening.